I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from ExpressNews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as I am every week, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News course reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Great to talk with you again, Elizabeth.
Hey, Chance. Good to be here.
So we have some very serious cases to discuss today. Let's just get right into it, starting off with the capital murder trial going on involving the death of a San Antonio police officer.
Yes, these are all, such horrible cases, and we've got a couple of them that will be coming up on the dockets this year that involve capital murder of a police officer. The first one that has come to us this year involves the death of, as you said, San Antonio police officer Robert Deckard. He was shot and killed in a chase for two suspects that were wanted in a string of armed robberies in San Antonio in 2013. And just last week, Shaun Ruiz Puente, 36 years old, was found guilty in Officer Deckard's death. And an Atascosa County jury, which heard the case, is also right now hearing evidence in the punishment phase on whether to send Puente to death. So my colleague Bruce Selcraig has diligently followed and reported this capital murder trial since it began in Jourdanton, which is in Atascosa County, on March 6th. Jourdanton is about 46 miles from the city center of San Antonio. So it's a nice little drive in the country, and it's away from Bexar County because Officer Deckard was killed in Atascosa County. So the trial is being heard there by their district attorney and her staff. So for those who aren't familiar with this case, early on December 8th, 2013, Officer Robert Deckard began to chase two suspects who were they were armed, and they were accused of some armed robberies that actually had occurred that day. They drove off in a Mitsubishi Lancer from near downtown San Antonio on South Interstate 37, hitting speeds at almost 115 miles per hour. Officer Deckard watched the Lancer's back window explode, and he called on his radio, with an unnatural calm, according to some testimony that came out this week in the trial that Selcraig has been covering. He was really calm and told an officer trailing him that they were shooting at him. This was about 2 a.m. And by then, the chase had gone over into Atascosa County. Well, Officer Deckard was shot in the forehead not long after that, which caused his Chevy Tahoe cruiser to crash into a tree off of Interstate 37 in Atascosa County. And 13 days later, Officer Deckard was taken off of life support. So Shaun Puente is the first of two defendants to be tried in Officer Deckard's death. His girlfriend, Puente's girlfriend, Genevieve Ramos, 28 years old, is awaiting her own trial in this case. She also is charged with capital murder. Puente's public defenders have said in opening statements that Puente was the person who shot that morning. They described it as a 1 in a million shot fired from, a speeding vehicle, one of his attorneys said, and also described it as a very complex case that deserved a lot of attention from this jury in Atascosa County. Now, on capital murder cases, we might have discussed this a while back when we were talking about a different case. But it takes a long time to seat a jury, especially when they're going to consider sending somebody to death row. So, they've been in the courtroom for a while. They're listening to evidence. And then when they finally, weeks later after convening, they come and they listen to these opening statements. It's interesting. I wished I could have seen it. And Bruce Selcraig described in one of his stories that, they described this as a 1 in a million shot fired from a speeding vehicle, and, pay close attention, to the minute details. And part of that is that Puente, his defense attorney said, was addicted to methamphetamine and had gone on a drug binge of several months, and was also mixing with that steroids, and police had said was also participating in a number of armed robberies in and around San Antonio, in the days, before Officer Deckard's shooting. So, explaining to the jury that, being addicted to drugs, he at some point was homeless. He was a desperate man on a drug binge. And, in the heat of the chase, I guess the implication here would be that, this 1 in a million shot was just that, a 1 in a million shot, because, how are you going to be able to do all of that at the same time and then, actually shoot somebody and especially in the place where Officer Deckard was shot. So, interesting testimony in a trial that lasted 9 days. Some testimony that was heard about what had happened, before this chase occurred, was that the owner of a convenience store on San Pedro Avenue testified that he was robbed at gunpoint by people that police said were Shaun Puente and Genevieve Ramos, and that this particular incident happened just before midnight on December 7th of 2013. And the convenience store owner said he thought that a customer was pulling a prank, but the person with, the armed person told him, "Don't laugh or I'll shoot you." So they took $285, according to testimony that we heard, lottery tickets, and some cigarettes. And they were also suspected of robbing a Jack in the Box on Cox Street before authorities spotted them near the south side when this chase began. Now, Bruce wrote in a story, that there were a lot of people in court there for support for Officer Deckard. He was affectionately known as Bobby by family and friends. He was the father of 2 children. And that night when he was on duty, when he was shot, it was a 9mm bullet that hit him. And authorities believe that there were about 35 shots that were fired at Officer Deckard from a Ruger pistol through this big hole in the back of the window of the Lancer. That I guess he was shooting out. He must have shot the window out. So after that happened, Puente continued firing more shots at a Wilson County sheriff's deputy, and they basically continued on with this chase until Puente's car ran out of gas. And then he and Ramos were were caught by officers and by canine officers as well. They had been hiding in a brushy area for hours in Wilson County. So, defense attorneys in their arguments had challenged experts that the state had brought, and they came in with their own experts, and they again brought up the fact that Puente was addicted to methamphetamine and had been on such a binge that he really didn't see who he was firing at. And they also argued that he, didn't have the intelligence to waive his Miranda rights when they, told him he had the right to remain silent. And going back to that 1 in a million shot, a national forensics expert that the defense brought called that, the 1 in a million shot because, again, the fact that all of that was going on, he just didn't really have the wherewithal, I guess, to really do that. Basically, if he would have tried to do it, he couldn't have done it. I guess the argument was trying to be made there. And then they also had another expert, that a psychologist from Austin, who said he thought Puente was truthful when he said that he had never got past the 6th grade. His father had been charged with murder. All of this came out in testimony, Chance. And his mother was beaten at home, and that he had been homeless and jobless and was a drug addict for much of his adult life. And that because he suffered from depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, it was possible that he was in a paranoid state brought on by the mess when the shooting happened. And this expert felt that because of these things, Puente couldn't have intelligently waived his Miranda rights and, just not said anything and sought an attorney. Well, after 9 days of testimony, the jury convicted Puente on March 21st. And I actually had a chance to cover the first day of the punishment phase last Thursday, March 22nd. The court heard sheriff's deputies testify how Puente had to be physically restrained while he was in custody after the shooting because he tried to attack deputies with a club that had been made from stacked bars of soap that had been wrapped in a piece of blanket and a shank that was formed from a jail-issued toothbrush. A deputy testified that because of these things, that they've actually had to change some policy in their jail because of what he was able to do with a couple of bars of soap. Because when they're in custody, they're given their jail uniform to wear, and then you get a toothbrush and you get some soap and you get a blanket and assorted other things that they need. But since this incident where a deputy actually Puente used a door to try to hit the deputy and then had concealed somehow a club and a club-like thing, like I described, with the stacked bars of soap wrapped in a blanket, and tried to hit him with it, and then had a shank that was very, a shank is kind of like a knife. It's got a sharp end to it that they're able to just kind of like file down in some way, from a toothbrush. So that was really testimony from the sheriff's deputy, and also video of the interview that was shown to jurors. But in these older courthouses, they're not set up for technology, so none of the gallery was able to see what the jurors were seeing in court. So That day, there was also very powerful testimony from Puente's first wife, who talked about how her life had changed when she married Shaun Puente after a 3-month courtship in, I believe, 2010, that she said sprung up from a friendship between their daughters. So they introduced their parents to each other. She also tearfully told the court that Puente was jealous, controlling, and violent when he drank. And she said that she had to take out numerous restraining orders. The police had to be called for domestic disturbances, and she was physically attacked by him and threatened. And it was a very, very powerful testimony from her, and it just said that I believe she had this quote while she was on the stand that he had told her that he loved her to death, that he would kill for her, he would die for her, and that he also would kill her. So she said she was very frightened by that and did what she could to take the steps, because she had children from a previous marriage, and I believe he did as well. But she was afraid that something would happen to her children, and also testified that she also did not want for her son to see his mother, get hit and that sort of thing. So it was very, very emotional testimony from his first wife. So that was one day of testimony in the punishment phase in this capital murder trial, which the jury in recess on Friday is supposed to pick up testimony again today, Monday. And this week, there should be more testimony in the punishment phase. It could last another week or two, since this is a capital case, which I mentioned earlier a little bit about capitals. Under Section 19.03 of the Texas Penal Code, if you kill a public servant on duty, commit murder in the course of another crime like a drug deal or a robbery, or if you kill a child under 10, you can be charged with capital murder, which in Texas is punishable only by death by injection or life in prison without parole. Atascosa County prosecutors are seeking the death penalty for Shaun Puente. And for them, this is the first such trial of this type that's been in Atascosa County since 1996. And as I said earlier, this is the first of 3 cases involving capital murder of a police officer that people in Bexar County will be watching this year.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney.
According to Bexar County court records, we should soon see Joshua Manuel Lopez in court. He is accused of killing Elmendorf Police Chief Michael Pimentel in August 2014 during a traffic stop. Elmendorf is about, I want to say it's probably about 35 miles southeast of San Antonio. Also on the Bexar County court's docket is Otis McCain. He is accused of killing San Antonio police officer Benjamin Marconi, who was ambushed outside of public safety headquarters in downtown San Antonio on a Sunday morning in November 2016. It was a really horrible, all of these crimes are horrible. I happened to be on duty the day that this happened, and Officer Marconi had was working an overtime shift, and he had pulled someone. He was working for patrol that day, just on an overtime shift, and he pulled someone over in front of public safety headquarters. And while he was in his squad car in the course of this traffic stop, someone came from behind and shot him in the back of the head. He was ambushed, and he died. And Otis McCain was caught, I believe, the next day. He actually had been seen on video. He was captured on surveillance video because he had been hanging around public safety headquarters that day. It was around noon when this happened. And when he was apprehended, he told authorities that he had been angry and frustrated about a child custody dispute with the mother of one of his children, and that prompted him to do what he did to Officer Marconi, who didn't see it coming. He was ambushed. So that should be an interesting case. All three of these cases are very tragic and very interesting. In the two that I just talked about, both of these defendants have court appearances soon. And just to follow up on a recent case we talked about, a jury is expected to be selected today for the trial of Mark Benavides. And this is the former San Antonio attorney accused of having sex with clients in exchange for legal services. We talked about him a couple of weeks ago when he had been indicted, I believe, on his fifth case. And he's going to trial this week. It's expected to start Tuesday and is being heard in Wilson County after a change of venue was granted because of intense media coverage of the former San Antonio attorney. So they moved the trial from San Antonio to Floresville, which is about, we have a trend here going, Chance. Floresville is about 30 miles south of San Antonio. So there's going to be some traveling going on.
And then to finish things off, Elizabeth, as you just mentioned, travel, something we haven't talked about so much. I think this might have come up maybe once or twice in our discussions on this podcast, The Docket. I want to talk about traveling and going to see, one of these cases or any case that would be in the Bexar County Courthouse or some of these locations around 30 miles that you just mentioned. Unless there's a specific reason, correct me if I'm wrong, if there is room, can't anyone go and attend one of these cases?
Yes, I mean, courtrooms are open. The public is invited to go see, proceedings. This happens quite often in Bexar County. Sometimes I'll be sitting, either watching a docket being called to see what kind of cases are coming up, or else I'm sitting in a hearing, and I'll identify people, because at the reporter you try to see, okay, who is, is that part of the defendant's family or these victims' families? And I generally try not to bother anybody during the trial, because I know that there are also a lot of attorneys don't want their, clients or their clients' families talking to anybody, while the case is being heard, especially in a courtroom, because you don't want, for witnesses or anybody to hear anything. This is what I hear from attorneys that I talk to. But court, the gallery is still open to the public. And there's many times you can see criminal justice classes from many of the colleges in San Antonio that go in there just to monitor, just to see, proceedings. It might be a required thing. Well, they'll go in, and many times the judges are also really good about it. They'll get up and they'll talk to the kids and ask them what their majors are or what they want their specialties to be when they're, practicing law. And, and then there's also people who are just, wanting to see, justice in action, just kind of want to see the whole trial proceedings. You'll see some retired people in there. Just, they go in and take notes, or just go in and they're quiet and they listen.
Yeah, I have actually, of course, in my own history of being a reporter and broadcaster, been to quite a few, probably not nearly as many as you, Elizabeth, but I think compared to most people, quite a few court cases. And yeah, there are some of these people that you just mentioned, people involved in the law industry and, perhaps one day going to be a lawyer or a judge or some sort of, job in that industry. And then you have people who are there for this specific trial. But I've also noticed, and maybe this is because I was working in a more rural community at the time when pretty much all of my court case experience happened, you kind of have people who just like going to see court cases being tried.
Yes, they do. I've seen some people that, when you start to see people in there, kind of like regulars that are not, this is going to sound really awful, and please forgive me, I don't mean to sound awful about it, but, sometimes I see people more than once. And so sometimes you're kind of trying to figure out, is this someone who's auditing, like with a classroom, or is this an activist in the community who's just wanting to exercise their right to, open government? Or, is this somebody, who's in trouble? So, but if I see somebody, or mostly people will ask why I'm taking notes, and if they see my badge or they see, the Express News logo on my notebook, they'll ask questions about the case. So I think it's kind of interesting. It makes me, wish that, gosh, one of these days when I'm retired, I want to be able to go and see how things work, just as a regular citizen.
Yeah, especially removed. Not having to take notes and all those things. I was in a similar position during the cases that I had to go to. And if I had the time and the ability, and specifically, if it was a case that was very important to me or just was rather interesting, and if anyone has any free time, I mean, what a way to honor the lives of these officers who have been lost by going to their court case and seeing the process, take place, and not necessarily being involved in that process, but seeing it take place and being able to appreciate that. It's not what it's like on TV. And it's so weird because you see TV so often, it's hard to separate yourself. When I was young, I watched Power Rangers. I really liked Power Rangers, but I didn't think that was real life. But watching Law and Order so much, and I'm not even a Law and Order fan, it's just on constantly when I was growing up, so I saw it quite often. It's hard to shake the idea that that's not what it's actually like. They do such a good job of making it appear to be what it actually turns out to be. And it's completely different. So I encourage anyone, especially with some of these, with all of these cases that we just mentioned today, regarding the police officers, go out and see what the process is like, and, in a respectful way for these officers who have lost their lives. But it's so interesting and so eye-opening, I think, for general members of the public. And then for someone like you, Elizabeth, and then perhaps lesser so for me, who has so much less experience dealing with courts and trials, to be there without a notebook, or in my case, usually a recorder, because I would have to use the audio actualities later on. That's quite a different experience. And that's something I think we haven't talked about so much on the docket, this podcast series, because we're so much focused on the case. But it really is quite an experience. And if there's a way for someone to experience that without being a member of the jury, without being a reporter or some sort of legal counsel, I encourage people to get that experience at least once. It's quite eye-opening, at least it was for me.
Yes, it's very good. You do raise a good point. It is very satisfying to see somebody who just kind of wants to see how justice works. And I have also seen, judges will have their, I've seen at least two judges have, a teenager, one of their kids in there just to watch the process. And I often wonder, okay, are you wanting your kid to, follow you in law, or is this like a cautionary tale, or, kind of what's the thing about it? But, I think that, gosh, it's to understand it, you have to see it, because there are so many different things about it that, after you look at a trial and you see the process of it, and you see what the law is, you kind of understand a little better, why things happen, why verdicts happen the way they do.
Or why they take so long, how a trial could take several weeks, and then you're like, well, that makes sense because I've experienced just, an hour of one trial. I know why it doesn't move so quickly.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I love it, but I kind of feel like, I feel lucky in the sense, or, I mean, it's weird, I don't know what your specialty was as a journalist, but I've always been a crime reporter, and it's a very, you either love it or you hate it, and to say that you love it only in the sense that I've met so many really wonderful people, and unfortunately I've met them because bad things have happened. You know what I mean? But it's an interesting thing to watch, the justice system in action.
Well, and as always, Elizabeth, thank you for your thoughts. This is why we do this podcast, The Docket. And of course, I'm joined weekly by San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala. And thank you again for the way you've described these cases today. Obviously, everything except the very last case that we talked about, which is a throwback to a previous episode. These are very difficult topics for a lot of people. So I appreciate the way that you've gone about explaining all this today. And of course, we'll hear from you next week as well. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Chance. Take care.
And of course, big thanks to San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me once again for this week's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.